It was almost 2 years ago, and we were ramping up for Augustine's third birthday, and we noticed that something was wrong with her. There had been a moment about a week prior to this where Augie had a low-grade fever, but then a few days later it went away. But then it reemerged again on her birthday. And I remember it was her birthday because we took her out to Pizza Man. Because she couldn't stop talking about going to Pizza Man. So that's where she wanted to eat for her birthday. So that's where she went. But she hardly ate anything. And the next day the fever was back. But this time it came back with a viciousness. I mean, it was a lot higher of a fever. And this time it wasn't going away with time. A week went by and she grew worse with each day, refusing to eat anything or to drink anything. She was moaning in pain over her stomach. And the most activity that we could get her to do was the walking from her bed to the couch to lay down. And about a week went by of seeing this and realizing that nothing was changing, and we knew something had to be done. And so we took her to the hospital because there was something wrong. It was a Saturday night, and so we were in there. Steph took Augie to the emergency room to figure out what was wrong. It was prescribed to her that she just had the common cold and she needed to take more children's Tylenol. And Steph came back and we were both bothered by this because we knew there was something more than the common cold, but we didn't know what. And so that next week we began scheduling more doctor's appointments as her fever continued to maintain a high temperature and she was very lethargic. After about 2.5 weeks of waiting, watching, worrying, and then traveling all over to figure out what in the world was wrong, we finally got the right diagnosis and got the right medication. She had a very bad bladder infection, and it was prescribed to have some antibiotics, and in just a few short days, it was gone. But if we had let it persist, that infection, it would have developed and spread into the kidneys and become something toxic for her. Simply giving her more Tylenol, it wasn't just the wrong diagnosis. It would have been very harmful for her. Because it would have been harmful because it would have just been masking the symptoms instead of treating the infection. Similarly, there are certain attitudes and assumptions that so many people have about life, about church, about God, that are unbelievably toxic. And the remedy for many people is simply to treat these symptoms of what they are feeling instead of getting at the infection of what is going on. And today we start a brand new sermon series called Toxic. Kill it before it kills you. And over the next few weeks, I want to talk about a handful of assumptions and attitudes that are toxic to their very core at a personal and spiritual level. And until you kill it, it will end up creating great pain in your life, a feeling of emptiness, and a sense of dullness and deadness on the deep level of who you are. And so here are some of the toxic assumptions that we're going to be addressing, that Paul addresses in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and 6, that bear striking resemblance to today. One assumption is that God wants me to be happy more than He wants me to be holy. The second assumption is that the church is about acceptance, not correction. Another assumption is to keep politics out of the church and keep the church out of politics. Another assumption is, it is my body, I have the right to do with it what I want. Paul addresses all of these assumptions in 2 chapters, and today we're going to talk about the first assumption. God wants me to be happy more than He wants me to be holy. And so if you want to follow along in your Bibles, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. So go ahead and turn there. But before we jump in, let me go ahead and say up front, this is probably one of the oddest and most disturbing situations that I think Paul ever had to deal with in a church. And it's hard for us when we read this to imagine, how could such a thing take place? How could such a thing take place, let alone cause a church literally to become proud about this? See, what has apparently taken place is there's this ongoing incestual relationship between a son and his stepmother. And this was horrible. It was horrible. It was wrong. And it was so wrong that even the surrounding Corinthian culture, and they had no relational boundaries at all. They looked at this and go, you just crossed a moral line. They didn't even have any morals to cross, but they saw this and they thought, this is wrong. And they condemned this kind of relationship. But apparently, in the church in Corinth, they did not. And here's what Paul says, starting in verse 1. He said, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that not even the pagans do not tolerate. A man is sleeping with his father's wife, and you are proud. Shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning and have put out of your fellowship the man who has been doing this? The fact that Paul has to address this and then mention that the pagans do not even tolerate it, it implies that this is not quiet. It implies that many people are well aware of this. This is widely known both inside and outside of the church. And the text implies that this is not just a kind of an accidental occasion. This is an ongoing situation. And the church, rather than stepping in to correct this issue, they are taking pride in it. And it is somehow they are making some sort of scriptural grounding for this. And so the natural question that surfaces for me are, how can this become such an icon of pride in the church? How can that become such an icon of pride? Not only that, how can Christians of all people think that this would be an okay way to live? Before we answer those questions, we have to back up and talk about something more fundamental, and that is, what does it actually mean to be a Christian? Or to kind of put it in a way that the early Christians would have asked, what does it actually mean to be Jesus' disciple? Well, Jesus made it crystal clear that He came to invite all people to Himself. He was sent on a mission to save the world, and He often gave teachings that said something to the effect of, everybody is welcome, everyone is welcome, everyone is invited to come. And to model this, Jesus invited ordinary disciples, ordinary fishermen. He invited a Roman IRS worker to be a part of His band. He invited a freedom fighter, two very judgmental brothers, a thief and a skeptic. Jesus invited them to be His disciple because He wanted to communicate who He was coming for. He was coming from everyone. But there was one preliminary expectation, that if you did not meet this, you would not be qualified to be Jesus' disciple. And so what was that qualification? What was that expectation that Jesus had? It was total and complete allegiance to Jesus. Jesus had to come first, and His word had to be the final word for you. You did what Jesus said. If you were unsure about that, if you were unwilling to live under the direction and the authority of Jesus, Jesus had no problem telling you that you were not fit to be His disciple. You were either all in or you were out. Everyone was welcome, but only those who were willing to live with complete and total loyalty to Jesus were accepted. Jesus had to be more important than everything and everyone else in your life. And at one point, Jesus said that He was to have more influence and more authority in our life over even over our own families and our own careers. Jesus told people that before they followed Him, they needed to count the cost. They needed to look into their heart, evaluate their motives. For those who weren't willing to put Jesus first, even ahead of their own spouses, Jesus says, you are not worthy to be my disciple. And so Jesus made it crystal clear. Everyone is welcome, but the expectation is you need to put Jesus first in your life. And this is a radical call that many people would see as very extreme. And you would be right to see this as extreme. It is. But if Jesus is God, He has all of the right in the world to raise the bar that high. And that would be fair. It would be just of Jesus to do that. So, for example, right? if somebody approached you and they wanted to, just imagine everybody in here is single, but they wanted to marry you, and so they proposed to you to become your husband or your wife, it is completely fair of them and right of them to ask that you be only loyal to them. That you have this exclusivity, you have this exclusive relationship, a unique relationship with them that you don't share with other people. That is right, that is fair, that is not narrow-minded. And joined with this idea of complete loyalty to Jesus was this idea that those who are Jesus' disciples, they would live out Jesus' teaching, and as a result, they would look like Jesus, which would look very, very different than the rest of the world. Almost like you were not a part of the world. That's how different it would look. And Jesus said this about himself in John 8:23. But he continued. He says, "You are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world." Later on, Jesus would describe why the world would reject the disciples, why the world would reject His disciples. And He tells them this important truth in John 15:19. He said, "If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world. But I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you." Jesus was not of this world, and as a result, He taught and He lived in such a way that the world didn't like that. And so the world rejected Jesus and killed Jesus. And Jesus says, "I have called you out of the world." And that's why the world is rejecting you, just like it rejected me. Jesus anticipates how hard it is going to be for His disciples to live for Him. Future disciples, and He prays for believers. He prays for us. And here's what He says in John 17. He says, "My prayer is not that you," speaking to His Father, "that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify," and that word means to set apart, to make them holy. He says, "Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth." Apparently, Jesus understood there would be this temptation to withdraw from society, to withdraw from the world, or at least to strongly wish to leave the world. But Jesus' prayer was not that His disciples would leave the world, but that they would be present in the world. That they would be those who transform the world rather than those who are transformed by the world. And as Christians began to live this out, it got a whole lot harder to do. And you find in the New Testament the apostles needing to remind the disciples of the original call. To remind them again and again, here is what Jesus has called us to do. 1 John makes it absolutely black and white. Here's what he says in 1 John 2:15. He says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love for the Father is not in them." John makes it clear. This is about your heart. This is about your passion. Ultimately, this is about what you love the most. In the world, it's not referring to people. It is referring to this mindset and this way of living that is completely self-absorbed. It is completely prideful and is ultimately opposed to God. And it's almost as if John is saying, look, if you are living with the model to do what is in your best interest alone, if you are living only to make what makes you happy, if you are living for what loves you the most, John says, then you need to realize that you don't have the love of the Father in you. And one of the reasons this is such a big deal in the New Testament, is such a big deal for God's people, is because God is trying to communicate something through His people. He's trying to communicate something through us. He's trying to get across is not just that God saves all people or that God can save all people, but that in some way God is actually present on earth through His people. But the only way that this would be seen as actually true is if there was something tangibly different with God's people. Almost like there would be certain characteristics of God that would begin to characterize the people of God. And if I said, for example, if I said my mother was Mother Teresa, you would expect that there would be certain characteristics, there would be things about me that would make me different than if I said my father was Hitler. You would expect different ways of living, different characteristics to be a part of who I am. To say it in another way, if the Creator God is truly present with His people, you would expect to see something notably different with those people. And a claim that God is somehow uniquely present with us, uniquely present with the disciples of Jesus, is to make a huge, substantial claim that requires some kind of proof with it. And one of the clearest proof that as Christians we have is living a holy life. That is to live out the very teachings of Jesus. Things like being a servant of all, loving your enemies, living a sacrificial life, living a life that is filled with hope. And this uniquely communicates God's character in a way that gives proof to the world that God is somehow present with us. I heard a pastor one time say this. He said, the world will see us as relevant, not when we look like the world, but when we look like what the world does not yet have. That when we begin to model what the world does not have, then they will be drawn to what they need, what they want. If God was really present with a certain group of people, you would expect those lives to truly be different, to be set apart. If you claim to have God living inside of you, like the living God, creator of the universe, living inside of you, and yet your life looks nothing like Jesus, you might think that that person is just beginning in their faith, or maybe they don't really have God present with them. Maybe they're lying to some degree. So to summarize everything, Jesus invited everybody in, but He invited them with the clear expectation that we would have full loyalty to Him. This in turn would become this model to the world that the people living for Jesus are communicating that God is present, actually present with us, in us, and the evidence would be seen in how we live. Now, where did things go wrong in Corinth? How did the early Christians, knowing this, understanding the teaching of Jesus, live in such a way that is actually opposed to God at its core? How could people justify having one foot in the world and another foot for Jesus, when it clearly says you need to have both feet for Jesus or you are not in? I mean, the expectation is to be in the world but not be of the world. To be God's presence on earth but not to pattern our life off of the lifestyle of the world, but to pattern our life after the teaching of Jesus. What Paul continues to encounter in the believers in Corinth is that they are claiming loyalty to Jesus all the while looking nothing like Jesus, but looking a whole lot more like their culture. Instead of being this diverse group that is unified in Christ, they are plagued with jealousy and division. Instead of being humble, they are setting up this spiritual pecking order for who the elites are in their congregation. Instead of serving others, they are finding all kinds of ways to serve themselves. The church in Corinth has this wacky idea of the gospel. And the gospel is the message about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and what that has done for us. And Bible scholars, they look at all of the dysfunction in this church, and they rightly conclude that the big issue, the fundamental issue in Corinth that is leading to all of these other issues is that they are modifying the gospel message. They are adapting it to be more acceptable to their culture. They are believing that when Jesus died on the cross, not only did Jesus forgive them, they understand that, but it has ushered them into this spiritual state that was no longer guilty of sin. They had made it. They had fully arrived. They are fully spiritual people. And so it was either that they were arrogant enough to see themselves as being above sin, or they no longer saw sin as having any sort of impact on them, that what they did in the body no longer mattered. It was no longer sinful because it had been canceled. Somehow for them, sin had been nullified. And now they begin to feel this sense of license to sin, at living free from any kind of consequence. To put it another way, since God saved them spiritually, what they did with their physical body no longer mattered. It wasn't a big deal anymore. And so how would you expect people to live their lives when their leaders are telling people the basic message? God really doesn't care how you live your life on earth as long as you are a spiritual person who believes in Jesus. If you put somebody in a room with all of the best tasting foods, high in cholesterol, and then you handed them a pill and you told them, if you take this pill, you're not going to gain any weight. You're not going to have any sort of developing heart issues, other health-related issues. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to see this as a license to indulge their own appetite because there is no consequence. There's nothing that is going to affect them, which is exactly what we see taking place in Corinth. The message the church in Corinth is teaching their people is giving people license to believe in Jesus and live as they want. It is saying to people, Jesus didn't just want to save you from sin, He also wanted to save you to sin without any consequence. This was the opposite to the actual teaching of Jesus. Jesus said, it is either living for me fully or not living for me at all. You are either in or you are not. Corinth is saying, come to our church because you can believe in Jesus and live the lifestyle that fits you the best. And where do most people gravitate? They gravitate toward pleasure. They gravitate toward happiness. They gravitate toward these. And when that begins to happen, people begin to believe this toxic assumption that what God really cares about in my life is my own personal happiness. That God cares more for my happiness than my holiness. And to some degree, this young man in their church is believing in Jesus and living as if he is married to his stepmom. That's weird. What was it that was causing this church to feel pride over this? Because he was living out a lifestyle that was making him true to his own personal pursuit of happiness. And Paul says, whoa, guys, you got this wrong. Like, this is not how it is supposed to be. It is not your own personal happiness that God wants for you. It is your holiness. Jesus didn't call you to Himself and then say, now go live fully for yourself. Jesus called you to Himself, and then He said, go deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. John even clarifies that loving this worldly mindset of living for yourself is actually opposing God's love for you. In fact, worse than that, living for your own happiness and self-fulfillment, what many today would consider to be living a free life, Jesus actually teaches us is not freedom. That is slavery. You finding your true inner self, your true inner identity, finding what ultimate happiness is all about by serving yourself, finding how to be a free person by being you, is not freedom, it is enslavement. And it's so powerful that people cannot imagine any other way to live. But Jesus cuts across all cultures and He reminds us that is sin. Living for yourself as the true ruler and judge of your own life. That isn't a form of happiness, it is a form of slavery. It doesn't bring freedom. John 8, Jesus says this. John 8:34. Jesus replied, Very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Sin at its very core is self-serving and is serving yourself. And the goal of Jesus coming to earth, it wasn't giving us what we think we needed freedom from. It was giving us what we actually needed freedom from. That's why Paul says it like this in 1 Corinthians 5:7. He says, clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump. Just as you are in fact unleavened, for Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. This passage kind of seems a little bit odd. It seems out of place from what we're talking about. But this is actually a very countercultural teaching and a very powerful teaching. Leaven, as many of you probably know, I'm not really a baker, okay? So I'll let my card show there. But leaven is this old batch of dough that begins to ferment. And then you would add it to a new batch of dough to continue that fermenting process. And what Paul is saying is that God's people are not meant to ferment. You're meant to be a pure lump of dough. How do you like that? You dough heads. We are meant to be a pure lump of dough, and the entire church in Corinth is in danger of being contaminated. But what is it that's contaminating them? It is this idea that Jesus has freed them and now they can freely sin, since what happens in the body is of little matter, it's of little consequence. This idea has led them to take pride in people who are living in ways that are actually contrary to God. And Paul says, when you let that self-absorbed, happy and pleasure-driven lifestyle, that mindset to infiltrate you and your church, it begins to work itself through the whole batch, through the whole church, and it begins to spoil everything. And it's interesting that Paul calls this worldly mindset something that has this corrupting and contaminating nature to it, corrupting and contaminating force about it. Because from where Corinth sat and where we sit today in our own country, living solely for what brings you the greatest amount of happiness and pleasure, like that's the goal of living. That's what life is all about. What else is there to live for when you die than to live for a full life here and now? And who can argue against the benefits? Who can argue against the personal draw to living this way, right? The message I'm saying is not a persuasive message. The message Paul's saying is not an encouraging message to many people. To argue against being a happy person sounds like you are arguing against truly being a human. It sounds like you are arguing against living a human life altogether. And this is what culture in Corinth, and this is what culture today is all about. Corinth was the Las Vegas of the ancient world, having an incredible amount of opportunities to indulge your own desires and to find all kinds of entertainment that you would love. And this is similar to America. We have every opportunity to indulge whatever craving we have. So how can living with this kind of philosophy be in any way corrupting and contaminating to being a human? Here's a story that I heard the other day that really illustrates how this can be so, damaging and harmful and corrupting. I heard a story about a guy who was interviewing various people in Budapest, and he was riding on a train to his next interview, and with him was his translator. This translator was a fairly young, newly married woman, and she began to vent to him. Both are Christians. She began to vent to him about every time she begins to open up with her friends, kind of venting about the struggles she had in life and her marriage with her kids, being a stay-at-home mom. She said her friends immediately jumped in, her non-Christian friends immediately jumped in to say, when she complained, they would say something like this: "Oh, just leave your husband. Put your son in daycare. Go back into the workplace. You'll be happier that way." And she said to the man on the train, "I just want to tell them, no, I like being a wife. I love my husband. I love being a stay-at-home mom. But it's just hard. This is human life. Help me to deal with it." And he said to this young woman, his translator, "It sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy." Fighting for her right to be unhappy. When the goal that we live for is happiness and pleasure, anything that seems to threaten that is encouraged to be cut out of our life, to cut off, to be removed. And anything that bears any resemblance of possibly bringing you unhappiness down the road in your life, it's just encouraged to not even go down that route. Not even try it out. This goal, this motive, it begins to pepper everything that it touches. It can destroy relationships. It damages families and friendships. And it encourages people, if you just simply walk away from your own faith, if you do that and it brings you greater happiness in your life, it's not only justified, it is encouraged. It's how the church in Corinth can look at a man clearly living outside of God's will for his life and take pride in him. Because he is following his heart. He is following what makes him the happiness. And even if the outcome is hurting his own family, it is hurting his own church, he is living that way, and that is okay for everyone else. And the church is applauding this, rather than reminding him that this is destroying his life and everyone else, and they are applauding his pursuit to be a happier man. And Paul says, as a church, you need to fight for the right to be unhappy. You need to fight for that. Because life isn't all about being happy. And in a world that is only living for happiness, that is an incredible struggle. And here's why this is so important. Here's why happiness is not ultimate. Here's our point today. Happiness is fleeting. Happiness is fleeting. Holiness is lasting. Holiness is the only lasting thing that we can truly live for. Happiness is a brief moment in time that, let's be honest, it only comes every once in a while. And most people spend their life chasing after this fleeting moment. When all comes down to living for what brings humans the greatest amount of happiness, this is toxic. Because it blinds us from investing, it blinds us to investing our entire lives chasing after a brief moment in time, rather than for our eternity. Jordan Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and he wrote a very popular book right now called The 12 Rules of Life. But he says this, and note, he is not a professing Christian, and this is a remarkable point that he makes. He says, it's all very well to think that the meaning of life is happiness, but what happens when you're unhappy? Happiness is a great side effect. When it comes, accept it, be grateful, but it's fleeting and unpredictable. It's not something to aim at because it's not an aim. And if happiness is the purpose of life, what happens when you're unhappy? Then you're a failure, and perhaps a suicidal failure. Happiness is like cotton candy. It's not going to do the job. But here's the deal. Being happy is not just enticing, it is enslaving. It is enslaving. It's hard to not desire to live any other way than what brings our immediate satisfaction and happiness. But feeling like we cannot live in any other way than to pursue happiness and feeling stuck to do nothing else that has a name, that's called slavery. When you feel like you cannot escape something and you feel stuck, that is slavery. And Jesus says that He has come to bring us true freedom, not the illusion of happiness. And that freedom is far more fulfilling and is far more satisfying than anything that we can chase after. True freedom is not found in living more for yourself. It is found in living for Christ. And the whole purpose of Jesus coming, dying, and rising wasn't to forgive us and then give us a license to return back to the jail cell, but to bring us freedom that can truly allow us to live the lives that we were truly meant to live. And that's why Paul says, for Christ is our Passover lamb who has been sacrificed. The importance of the Passover lamb was that the lamb that was sacrificed in the Exodus story, it was what brought God's people freedom from their slavery in Egypt. The blood that was smeared on the doorpost, it was what brought them freedom. It granted them freedom. And Paul says that is what Jesus has done. He died as the Passover lamb, freeing the people from their real slavery to sin. And that is what Jesus did. That is what Jesus continues to offer us. But living as if happiness is more important than holiness, it is a toxic desire to other people, because other people oftentimes get in our own way when we're trying to live a happy life. But it's also toxic because we return to the very same place that Jesus came to set us free from. And what is truly sad about the church in Corinth is that this mindset is seeping out toward those who actually need hope, those who actually need joy, those who actually need saving. Instead of finding what real life is all about, Corinth is inadvertently saying, come to Christ and remain in your chains. But Paul says, guys, you're not called to live like that. There is more to your life than living for yourself. There's more to your life than living for a happy life in the end. The infection that leads so many people to dedicate their life to a life pursuing happiness is a deeper issue than what it may seem. The goal is not to treat the symptoms of the heart. The goal is to fight against the infection in the human heart. Tylenol, right? That's happiness. Tylenol is not going to fix our hearts. It will only momentarily disguise the symptoms we are feeling until we reach a point of breaking where the Tylenol doesn't do the trick. What we actually need is a cure to the infection that the human heart has, and His name is Jesus. And when we give our life to Him, we are promised the cure to our own lives. And living for Him is the path of freedom. And if we can narrow it down and say, living for Jesus is the happy life, then that is it. It doesn't mean it looks the same way. It does mean it is a joyful, fulfilled, purposeful life that the human heart craves to have. But that is only found in Jesus. I'd like to invite the team to come forward to prepare for offering.